So this is Aubrey Semple from the Association of Black Argumentation Professionals, and we are going to have a webinar talking with Anthony Berryhill. The topic is on debate in the college administration process. And I want to take the time first, Anthony, to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to have a conversation about the college admissions process and debate. And hopefully we can take this conversation and make it a fruitful one so we can share it amongst all of our members and help students try to get into college. With that, first, I want you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background and your relationship with debate.
Yeah, so my name's Anthony Berryhill. I currently work as Managing Director for Victory Briefs, which is one of many summer debate institutes that covers a wider range of activities, so NYCUDL debate, public forum debate, and probably soon a cross-examination debate as well. In terms of my general background, I actually come from a very tough background. Pre-Katrina New Orleans, about 20 years ago, I was a student who lived in inner city New Orleans. First-generation student, none of my siblings went to college themselves, and the whole idea of even applying out of state was literally like speaking a different language. So I went, I was in the public school system. I was found by a program called the Breakthrough Collaborative now, but it used to be called Summer Bridge. That helped me move to a school called Isidore Newman High School, the same school that Eli, Peyton Manning, and the rest of the Manning family went to as an academic scholarship student. And from middle school to high school, I was a high school debater doing NYCUDL debate, student congress, and extemporaneous speaking. And while doing all of that, as I'm sure we'll talk about in this webinar, I had some resources from Newman, but the prevalence of the kind of strategizing about college really wasn't in the public dialogue, so to speak, even at a school like Newman. So I very much had to figure out my own strategies for how to not just apply debate skills, but just generally how to read applications, how to find out what people are looking for, and mostly how to talk about yourself for your own very challenging stories. So that's one of the reasons I want to do this webinar, and thank you for having me. It's to kind of like unravel some of that information that, frankly, students who have a lot more resources are able to get access to, and democratize that a bit for the membership, so that we can all kind of benefit and get our students to where they need to be, whether it's college or a job that pays more money or however else.
All right, and with that, I figure that we could transition to our first topic. Sure. And pretty much is about the experience of going through the college process. So as a former debater, I imagine that your experience with the college process might have been different from others. So can you talk to me a little bit about how, or did debate help you become prepared to dealing with the college process?
It most certainly did. So as a bit of background, I went to Stanford for undergraduate, almost on a full ride as much as you had back then, and then Yale for a PhD program. So I went to some fancy schools that I couldn't afford, but I went to them. I would say yes, in two different ways. So I think it was participating was preparing me in ways I didn't expect. So obviously when when the debate coach in my school recruited me, he didn't say, do this for college. He just, it was something I just wanted to do. And it indirectly prepared me. And I think that's one thing a lot of our students don't know. Just the ability to stand in front of a group of people and not sound foolish is something that not just colleges, but every employer is dying and desperate to find, right? So the mere activity of having to stand in front of a group of people, give structured speeches that are directly topical and relevant, and to think extemporaneously, no matter what event you're doing, speech or debate or whatever combination, that alone was very helpful in a couple of ways. The first way was in terms of interviews. So most of the time interviews are, they're one part of the process where an alumnus will speak to the student and ask their general interests and passions, what have you. Debate makes that very easy. It's very easy to be, you're not nervous like most people. It's easier to do well on those components. I think the other way is in terms of just if you do it right, the whole application process. Because we write and read so much, we get a lot of practice, whether you know it or not, in terms of answering the kinds of questions that are very deep and personal and involved, like the ones that undergraduate colleges ask. So I would say in those two ways, in terms of skill development, certainly. And I think one direct way is just, frankly, if you're a person from a marginalized background, doing even okay in debate is a plus factor, as they call it, admissions. Even if you are not a national champion, if you do well locally, colleges don't find that very often. So it's automatically a differentiator.
I see. So, I mean, was there a difficult part of the college process that you, had to experience? And if so, what was it?
There were two. First, and these are difficult for all students because one thing, one part of my background I didn't say is that I also do private counseling for people and work through various firms that have reached out to me to say, hey, help us help children, right?
Right.
So this is true for all students. So the first place that's hard for everyone is just knowing what colleges are. And what, because there's such a range, right? There's schools that are 2-year, 4-year, in-state, out-of-state, liberal arts, the whole gamut. So for me, even though I went to a pretty very, very high quality high school, there just isn't anywhere to kind of take all that information, the thousands of schools, and make it sensible to say, okay, what are the 10 I'm applying to, or 5 or 8? So that was just a lot of research. And for me, I'm going to date myself. This was around 1999. So we didn't have YouTube. Yeah. So it was harder, actually. Yeah. We didn't have YouTube. Applications were mostly by paper. None of the conveniences, right? So that was one part. The second part was just writing the essays, particularly if you come from a very tough background. I mean, it took me 6 weeks to figure out what my thesis would be. How do you say? Yeah. Right. Like, you go through an environment of violence, go to an environment where you're going to a school where there's almost no one who looks like you. You're super poor. You're taking these hard classes, and your parents don't really respect or understand what you're doing sometimes, depending on the background, right? So trying to answer a question like, what do you like and what are you interested in? You're trying to figure out how to survive, much less how to answer these deep, probing questions about leadership and failure.
Can you still remember your college essay that you submitted for schools?
Actually, it's funny you say that because I went to my old high school for a debate tournament, judging last weekend, and I found the old, the old student publication that published my essay, and I typed it out. I'm happy to share it with the membership because I actually have it as of literally a day and a half. But I very much remember it. It was it got a lot of attention. It was published by the Times-Picayune newspaper. It was, the thesis of it was quite literally where my life was, which is kind of describing my life almost as a war. I think the movie Saving Private Ryan came out around this time, again, 97 to 2000. And I'm like, I am Private Ryan, except I'm Private Berryhill, and I'm living in a war where I go to, let me be blunt, a school full of rich Caucasian students, and then I go home to the parts of New Orleans that are no longer with us because of Katrina. But neither group accepts me or completely. So I'm trying to get out of here. I need to get out. I need to escape. And it's describing what that process was like. And this whole life story of I'm trying to get out of poverty by going to college. Why would I want to do that? What is my life? And that was the thesis of the essay. I'm happy to share it.
Well, that's amazing to hear because I feel like a lot of kids outside of the debate space definitely have a story to tell. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that there are people out there like yourselves that can be able to guide them with that narrative as some sort of way of standing out. So with that, let's fast forward from the 90s to now. You're now a college advisor. So how has your experience in debate helped students navigate through the college process?
Oh, sure. So I think one way it's funny because I use a lot of those same debate skills now, if not more intensely. Ooh. Right. So one skill is cross-examination. And I think that's also going to show a lens to where people struggle. Like everyone struggles here. Mm-hmm. The first thing is just people how do I put this? They lie to themselves.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Like, our students are teenagers, so they have all this social programming and they want to conform and they want to tell us what we want to hear, which is the opposite of what colleges want to hear. So, for example, common essays are things like, I love math and science. I'm such an obedient child. Well, great, but that's an automatic rejection.
All right.
Especially if you're looking at a school like Stanford, per my polo, that want people who are challenging and innovative, what have you, right? Or students will say things that they think are things that a high schooler should say. For example, Duke University likes to ask a question, what is your favorite book? And students love to say the books that they think that English teachers would like The Great Gatsby or Hamlet. which is not a bad answer if you're giving an honest answer. Right. But if you're being cliched and just saying these trite phrases, that's what that causes rejections pretty fast.
In other words,
like people lying to themselves.
Cheat sheet response.
Yes, thank you.
Topical questions in an interview and expect to be different, essentially.
Correct. Right, or even expect to pass, right? Because if the rule here I tell my students is if you're being cliched, there's at least 500 students who've given the same answer because they're struggling. And so one of my main rules is tell the truth. Whatever that truth is. If the truth is you had a tough life, say it. If the truth is you hate science, but all you want to do is art, say that. Whereas a lot of students, the reason they struggle is because they're not comfortable with telling a story about themselves, because they feel like they have to give the perfect answer, or the answer their parents would like, or the answer their peers would think is cool, which is entirely different from what an admissions officer may think is cool or acceptable.
I see. And with that, here's a scenario. So in terms of like telling the truth, right? Yeah. Debaters tend to think that success in debate is that truth that sells to admission officers at schools. So in other words, does it even matter if you, and I think you might have answered it, but I need more clarity here. Does it really matter if success impacts whether you have a like heads up on the competition to getting into college? Is that a stop?
Well, like many things that we learn older in life, it's not linear. Right, it's very, very intersectional. It's sometimes random. So here's what I mean. The way that folks think in high school is if I win a certain number of tournaments, I have a better shot. They think the same. It's not just debate, by the way. They think this way about the SAT and about GPA scores, which are important, but not in the way that, is simple to understand. So like, I'm going to use an example. So many times students will just completely fool themselves. They'll think, I have 100 more SAT points, I'm more qualified, or I'm going to get in. And then colleges laugh. Because, if you take Stanford as another example, right, I think there was a quote from the dean that said, if we took all the students that have perfect GPAs, we would have to build 6 times more dorms. Schools can't, if you take any pool, like successful debaters, high testing SAT scores, etc., there are 2 things to consider. The first is that schools can't take everyone of any one population. So even of the population debaters, they're going to take debaters who are the top debaters and debaters who are okay, and debaters who maybe were not as successful or their success was limited. They're going to take a full range because they're looking at 30 different factors. They can't all take one thing. And that's true of the SATs, true of the GPAs, true of even like level of class, things like that. The second thing is that different factors can matter differently based on who you are. And this is particularly important for students from marginal backgrounds. So I work with a lot of women of color of different races, et cetera. If you're, Asian American and Pacific Islander, that's a different conversation in terms of how debate shows up than other groups. Male, female distinctions, differences based on sexuality, those things in each individual person tells a different story. So in my case, I was maybe a top 20 nationally, but I was never winning I wasn't winning, national tournaments. Right. But one thing, debate helped me in that regard, because the question was like, how is the student able to go to school, much less be competitive?
Right.
If you just use one axis and say number of tournaments won, that's not the way that schools think of it, because they have a different mandate. One thing I always say at Victory Briefs, I give every year, every summer, I give a lecture on doing admissions from a debate perspective. And the thing I say to them is, if a dean of admissions said, I have all the perfect SAT and GPA students in our class, they would be fired quickly. Because they have to find the best, they have to find the gold medal winners, the ukulele players, all those kinds of things. To put it very, very concisely, almost every undergraduate does some form of a brag speech when students come in for orientation, where the dean of admissions will say, we have students who come from all 50 states and 30 countries. We have people who are in the X Games, people who are Madden 20 champions. Not kidding. Esports is a big thing. But that's their key performance indicator. Like, can they brag about finding the next Oprah Winfrey, Tiger Woods, YouTube star. They want the best of everything. And I think where debate helps is that particularly students who come from tougher backgrounds or backgrounds where we don't have as much representation, those become plus factors. Like the better you do, that helps, but it's not linear, right? It's not like, so if, no matter how well you do, it depends on how you do it and what the rest of your file looks like. So that should be helpful, but also less scary to people.
Right.
Because sometimes debaters will say, I wasn't a top 50 debater. I'm like, it doesn't matter. You're already 90th percentile in your school based on your skills and what you've already done.
So with that, how can, for example, coaches be a part of that process? I mean, for many coaches, they're spending so much time with these students, far more than they would have with their other in the classroom. They know their students' strengths, their weaknesses, and pretty much their ambitions for the future. So how can they be a part of that process as a debate coach to a student?
Yeah, I think, and I feel like my former debate coach with this too. I think it's doing what you're already doing, but just adding one more conversation, right? Like, because I think there's so one danger I see with debate coaches, you know what I mean? I coached for 20 years, but debate is a beautiful thing, but we never want it to be the only thing that our students think about, because that's dangerous too in its own way, right? So trying to make sure to keep perspective with the students, say, hey, we're going to be working together for the next 4 years, but I want this to be useful for you later. Right. So starting those conversations from someone's novice year or their first year, saying, what are your goals here so we can orient your debate stuff and the experiences you're doing. Like if someone's school is to get a 4.0, perfect, whatever, and go to Harvard, that should probably look different from someone who's thinking differently. So I mean, a lot of these things are contextual, but I would say just incorporating it with the normal conversations across time, probably during the summers or times when you're not prepping for tournaments. Trying to get a pulse on the student, what they want out of life, and then drawing those connections. And I think that also helps from a recruitment standpoint too. Because it's hard to get students. It's easier if you can actually, and one of these when we're doing this webinar, if you can make the argument literally make the connection between participation and going to wherever you want or getting into scholarships, etc.
Well, you know what? Now that we're jumping into coaches being part of the process, I figured that I want to throw some scenarios at you. So, for instance, I'm going to pretend to be a student, a debater on your team. How would you help these following students based off of where they are? So, scenario one, right? So, I do well at circuit tournaments. I got bids galore to the TOC. I'm probably going to break late at many national tournaments. GPA is terrible. Right?
How terrible.
How can you help me get ready for the college process?
Yeah, how terrible, if you will.
I'm talking about if it's SAT 1s, it's probably at like 1,000.
Okay.
You know, a sub 3.0 maybe low. Like what, or how can you help that child who, by the way, is very successful in debate?
Yeah. Part of it depends on what year they are, but let me give you the general answers. So if you're in that bucket, the first thing to note is there are plenty of colleges that will take you. What we have to manage the students' expectations, because sometimes kids are like, oh, I can just bomb school and not show up and blah, blah, whatever. And because I won the tournament champions, I'm going to Harvard. That's not how it works. Win a gold medal, and even then it's hard, right? So I would say to them, making sure they're aligned on where do they want to, if they want to go to college, where do they want to go to college? And does that fit the general numbers where you are? That's step one. Like, we got to make sure, like, if you're in this bucket, Berkeley's probably not a conversation. But there are plenty of phenomenal schools that will have higher admit rates, anywhere from 40 to 70. And actually, this kind of student, if those numbers were slightly higher, they could walk into really good schools. They may not be on the U.S. News and World Report, which I have not much respect for as a rankings organization. But there are plenty of schools that will take students who are in the 1100 to 1300 range, or 3.0 to 3.4 range, which frankly is most students.
Okay. All right. Scenario two, does well in debate, but not the greatest. How do I stand out as a scholar that wants to go to a top tier school? Now, this child is probably rocking with a 1200 or higher, probably at a 3.2, 3.3 or higher. How can you help that child?
Sure. So the first thing I would tell them is advertise their successes at school. And I think actually this is going to be true for all of the students, but particularly the better you do, the more you should do it.
Oh, okay.
So this is a trick that my coach did for me. Because there's so many different components. One component are the teacher recommendations. One component is frankly how the school feels about you. So making sure that you're advertising what you're doing so that people can appreciate that, and then that shows in the letters.
Now, when you say advertising, I mean, I have some colleagues that talk to me about various ways to advertise yourself. I know that kids like to use like video, resumes in a sense to try to stand out. Like, does those tactics work? Are there examples of how students can stand out when trying to be,
Oh, absolutely. And these are things I suggest all of the time. So number one is making really good relationships with teachers.
Oh, okay.
I cannot say how important that is. Like they need to, I say to my clients, be it free or not free, you need 2 to 3 teachers who love you. Who are going to say, I know this kid's really smart, not just because of they're a great debater, but because of what they do in the classroom. Let me give you examples. So no matter what scenario we talk about, like every student, especially the ones in the first category, they need to make sure they have those relationships where teachers can say with high levels of specificity, these are the things they did in the classroom that was so exceptional, and I can see how debate helped them.
Okay. So,
in every scenario, we want students who are doing their job. Like even if they're struggling, the teacher can say they hustle. Here we work after school. They always turn in their homework. They are being use the word scholar. That's one inroad, particularly for this category. Talking about your debate success as a scholar. So it's not just I'm debating. It's rather I'm researching topics that are pretty sophisticated, even for graduate students. And talking about that, if you're going to talk about debate, be that specific. Talk about the literatures you've read. Like if you're a student of economics, talk about that. If you're a student about racism in the criminal justice system, that's a hot topic too. So think of your debate performance not just in terms of competitive success or public speaking skills, but as your proof of early scholarship, because that's what a professor is going to want to see, and the admissions officers are going to want to see too. In terms of marketing, I would say. Students, whenever they can, they should tell their local newspaper if they've done something really well. You qualify the national tournament, National Urban Debate League Championships. There should be a note from the principal or from yourself telling the newspaper, and then submit that article to colleges.
Wow.
That's one thing I did when I was doing various kind of, we'll talk about competitions probably later, to making sure that others know what you're doing, because that counts more than you saying it yourself. And I guess the last thing, you can use YouTube. So putting up your own debate rounds online could be a good idea. Caveat, it should be the kind of round that is publicly consumable, understandable,
right,
and things like that. Like it's not the time to act up or be super debater.
Because again, you're selling a product yourself that they can understand, I assume.
Yes. Yeah. So making your work as visible as possible. For this category in particular, I want to emphasize the students are probably often, I have to work with a lot of students in this bucket. They often feel very insecure about their success and whether or not debate is even something they can talk about. I actually had someone talk about this a week ago. They need to kind of get over that when it comes to this conversation. Because their perception of success is not the same as admissions officers, right? Admissions officers aren't counting your win-loss records or how many tournaments you won. They're looking at your overall profile. They're not rank ordering all the debaters 1 to 100. They don't care. They don't care that much about debate. But what they care about is debate as a marker or proxy for other things, like your ability to speak, your ability to research, your ability to handle adversity, your ability to take a loss. All those kind of things that debate coaches always talk about anyway. Those are the things that make it very, very powerful as an admissions add-on, even if you're not the best at debate.
Wow. I mean, with that, I want to go with this last scenario. So, for instance, suppose I had a ridiculously bad year, and it so happened to be my junior year, okay? Is there any hope for a child that has severely had a bad academic year probably didn't do too well in their standardized test.
Sure.
Are there still hope for those type of students in terms of getting access to scholarships or even admittance to top choice schools?
Yeah. It's about it's about the story. The first thing is why.
Right.
If it was because of a lot of outside factors, I'm sure. I imagine a lot of a lot of debate coaches are working with students who work extra jobs,
Yeah.
right? Who have parental issues, blah 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 blah. Two things to note: one, you do get sort of a pass here, particularly if you come from a tougher background. It's not like a 1-point GPA pass,
Right.
but a 3.5 could look different for you than a 3.9 looks for someone else, where it's much more understandable. So there's an adjustment there. The other thing is if you can show that there's a strength or a shift, that's really important. So, for example, someone who has a disastrous junior year, we would write an optional essay explaining what happened, but talk about other things you've been doing academically that's interesting, right? So that's where debate can be helpful. I've even told students, hey, okay, you bombed at your GPA, but they'll pay a lot of attention to, in those kind of scenarios, if you're still in the game for a top level university, they will pay very close attention to your senior year grades, especially semester 1. So you can't bomb that semester.
In other words, when it's that mid-grade report,
yeah,
that's what really makes the difference for that child that could redeem themselves.
Yeah, because if you just bomb all the way through, you haven't made an argument for yourself.
Right. If anything, that's like a turn, right? Like you just made it bad enough for them not to get into the school of their choice. I see.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of a sub point to this that I encourage students to think about. That unfortunately for students of color in particular, like class selection's everything.
Really?
Yeah,
What?
it is. Well, sometimes students will take classes they just shouldn't be taking, and they have to be very thoughtful, right? It's important to take the hardest classes. That's great, but kind of like when you're in college, your performance matters more than the classes you're taking.
Right.
Getting a D in an AP class is not helpful. I'd rather see an A in a regular class.
Okay. So does that mean for students that have access to AP classes or various options of AP classes, is it strategic for them to try to pick those AP classes that might work out well for them in terms of their performance versus a student that may not have access to a bunch of AP classes? So it's like either I take it or I can't demonstrate I can handle hard work. Like, how do you navigate through that?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing about this answer is that it applies to everyone, regardless of your level of resources. You should be strategic anyway.
Okay.
So, because if you bomb a class and get a C or a D, it's a grade point average. The averages will punish you. You just can't afford a D or an F or a C if you can avoid it, right? So I mean, in my own experience, like I knew I was terrible at 2 subjects, history and science. Bad, awful. So I didn't take those APs. I stayed far away from them. I was actually ironically better at math and English and Spanish, right? So I knew if I took AP Bio, that was an F waiting to happen. So I didn't take it. And no one knew it, no one cared. No one knew any different, right? You don't, in other words, I guess the first thing I'm saying is you don't want to create unnecessary, like in debate speak, you don't want to argue evidence that will hurt your side.
Yeah.
And that includes your classes, right? So don't take, one student from the inner city in New Orleans kept taking Latin. And I'm like, why are you taking Latin? You don't like it. You're bad at it. And that will just 3 units of F. That's dumb. Don't do that. But a lot of students do that, right? So number 1. I think number 2, let's talk about the student who doesn't have access to AP classes.
Right.
Or, that's actually not a bad thing. Because number 1 is, one of the factors that colleges will look at is, are you taking those challenging curriculum available to you? Because schools are looking at, I know there's been a whole controversy about the adversity score.
Yeah.
That should signal to
Can you
people.
explain what that means, by the way, in terms of the adversity score?
Yeah. So the general argument that colleges are looking for is they know that a lot of the numbers and the test scores they depend on context, right? And who's and the idea of an adversity score was something where the SAT would not just give you your score, but they would give like a secret report sort of to colleges saying, here are the resources and the general scores and the demographics of where this student's from or student in their neighborhood or in nearby places. Mm-hmm. They called it an adversity score. I think it was a number. There's not much more I can tell because it was not transparent at all, which is part of why it was so controversial. But that's the general idea, which is that schools, and I think the SAT understood this, the numbers don't just speak for themselves. They're always, there's a story behind it, right? Like, so in this case, when schools are looking at your classes and your grades, they're not just looking at you, they're looking at you compared to what I could reasonably expect. So for example, I had a 3.5, which normally would not be competitive, but I went to many would argue, the hardest school in the state. It's like if you're going to college and you have a 3.4 at West Point, you're not going to be looked down upon. Like they're going to say, how did you get a 3.4 at West Point? That's very impressive because you have to go through so much other stuff. So if you have no AP class at your school, normally a counselor or someone at the school will write, they will explain all the courses available at your school and your application will be evaluated by that baseline.
I see. Okay. So with that, let's transition from access to college to access to scholarships.
Yeah.
Right. So especially for students that are, really competitive in debate, but they don't really see themselves involved in the college debate route where the scholarships may lie. How can those students excel at getting free money?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of free money. Yes. I'll start with the way I did it. So I knew there was no chance I was doing college debate at all. Debate already took enough of my life. And at this time, Stanford didn't have a policy debate team. So it was not an option. I would argue, and very few students do this, there's a lot of debate, I would call them debate adjacent things. So things that if debaters just apply, the money's there for them because they're so good at these things, right? So a few buckets. There's a lot, actually, nowadays, unlike when I was competing, there's a lot of debate competitions. I can give some names here if you'd like. That will have a debate topic and in a very lay, public debate format where they're willing to give kids money if they do well. So one of them is called the Coolidge Cup. That's actually yep.
It's sponsored by the Coolidge Foundation.
Yes. Yep. The Ronald Reagan Great Communicator debates. And those are debate events, and that's not even counting the speech events. So there's a lot of oratory events. So one I did was the Veterans of Foreign Wars. It's you have to be a bit patriotic because it's run by the VFW, the Voice of Democracy contest. But they have $18,000 to $20,000 to give away, and I ended up placing in it too. What else is there? Are just various essay contests, so writing contests. So there was one that was hosted by Louisiana State Bar, where the topic was quite literally a Lincoln Douglas debate topic on elector privacy. It was literally an LD topic. $400. Here you are, in cash, and aligning your resume, right? So I think so. I can certainly send a list, but I would say to debaters and people doing speech, like the number one problem is that they don't want to apply because they think they're too busy.
Right.
But it's free money, and here's a nasty little secret. Not a nasty little secret. B, getting those things does what I often talk about as external validation. You want, and just a general strategy, no matter who you are, you want as many people on the outside talking about your credibility as humanly possible. So it's one thing if you're just a debater who does well nationally. It's another if you're a debater and, say, the Coolidge Foundation flew you down for their national tournament. Right. That gives you much more credibility even against other debaters. Or if a major organization, if you just place locally, right? Or, if you're a middle school and you did a geography bee, those things don't look like they're really important, but because they're so distinct and they're from outside forces, those could be the kind of things that differentiate you if you're struggling in the debate sense or you're struggling academically. Those all count as extracurriculars and as academic performance.
Do you think students sometimes go a little overkill when it comes to the plethora of extracurricular activities that they engage in just for that add-on on their resume for steps?
That's an everyday headache.
Is there a way out of that? Because I know many kids, they're on the debate team, they do Model UN, they're in Sing, like there's so many things. Like, is that strategic?
No. God, no. Not strategic, no. And colleges are pretty obvious about this. They're being very loud about it.
Right.
Two reasons. One, when you do an application, applications are long, but there's not that much space.
Right.
So if you do 15 activities, you quite literally cannot put 15 activities on the common application. On the coalition application, you can probably put fewer. And even then, there are character limits, right? So doing a billion activities just doesn't make sense because you cannot talk about them all. Second problem is it's a strategy that colleges already know. So it's kind of like, I call it the high school way of thinking, more better. It's not always better, as we all, as debate coaches know. Like, more arguments does not mean you win. It can mean the opposite. And I think, kind of like as I was talking about with college, with courses, the strategy is everything you do should matter. So if you're part of theater, but you don't really put much time into it, or you're part of a club and you're just showing up one time a week, that is it's more likely to annoy an admissions officer than it is to be impressive. Particularly for students who are paying for coaches, what they'll often be told, I mean, I'm one of them, is to say, look, we need to talk about the one or two things that you're really, really good at. What is that? The term we use is a spike. So we'll literally say this student, high GPA, high test scores, and 3 spikes: debate, art, and they have this background issue. Notice I didn't say key club or student government.
Right, very general, in a sense. Well,
yeah.
Those descriptions are just more general in terms of, like, they're good at art, they're good at something in music, and I see.
Yeah, schools want specialists. They want people who are really good, but they specialize in one or two things. And that specialty can be very broad. You could be an expert poetry person. You can come from a really crappy situation at home and do above average in the classroom. That counts.
Right.
What they're not looking for is what used to be called well-roundedness, right? Which is why kids are doing all these activities. Well-rounded usually means rejected. Because well-rounded usually means you're not committed to anything and you're just doing a lot of stuff just to do stuff. And colleges they've figured that out.
Pretty much the master of all things is usually a jack of none, right? So
yeah.
With that said, I guess what I want to do with the time remaining is I kind of want to ask you a question more on the opposite side of access to college, because I know that there are some students that may participate in debate, but they're very adamant about, you know what, I don't want to go to college. I don't see myself as a college student. So have you had experience with students that excel well in a space that prepares them for college, but they don't even want to go to college?
Yes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. It's a bad thing if they have no direction, right? If they're just like, I just don't want to go to college and I'm not even thinking about a vocation, then I just scratch my head this, what have you been doing the last 4 years? Right? Like, the key thing is a direction. Like, I mean, Mike Rowe is one guy who does a lot of talk about dirty work and, like, vocational jobs, right? Like, I would argue in many cases those kind of jobs make a heck of a lot more money and will get you better jobs than in college. And I've gone to 11 years of college and I see it all the time, right? So this is not inherently a bad thing, but my qualifier to that is I would still want to have those conversations with the student to say, if not college, then what?
Right.
If you want to be a welder, that's great. Want to be a plumber, that's great. If you want to do social work, that's great. But it's really narrowing them down on some sense of what that goal could look like, and then having conversations about how to get there. And even in terms of college, no one says you have to go to a 4-year college immediately. You can go to a 2-year college, go to community college, get all A's, and then transfer to Harvard someday. Like, there's so many different ways to be successful in this regard and use your debate skills and set yourself up economically and socially and whatever. If you're thoughtful about it, which is kind of like one of the themes here. It's not just college or no college. It's really having those conversations with the student as a person and saying, what do you want? And let's make sure that you're hitting deadlines, be it in terms of a trade school, be it in terms of an art school, whatever that looks like. And so when I worked with students on that, that's the conversations we have. Even if it doesn't involve college, I want to know, where do you want to be in 5 years? And then we reverse engineer from there.
I see. All right. So with all of that, I want to thank you. We're going to end here, and I want to leave with parting words. So if there's any thing that you haven't said, if there's like that one last bit of advice that you want to give to educators that are working with kids in regards to the college process, what would it be?
I'll say two quick ones. The first one is encourage students to be confident in what they want and what they don't want. Because I think one of the things where students struggle badly is that by the time they're doing college applications, they've never thought about themselves. They never thought about, if I want to go to college, who do I want to hang out with? What majors would I want to do? What do I not want to take? Where do I want to be in a big city? Do I want to be in a place that's not? And encouraging students to think about themselves as whole people earlier than senior year will really set them up emotionally and psychologically for this process. Because we think so much about GPA and SAT, but a lot of kids lose and get rejected because they can't because a lot of those college questions, they're probing you for those kind of deeper questions about you as a human being. Like literally, I was working with a student who had an essay question on what do you define as your home? What kind of community do you want to be a part of? This is a top 10 school asking this question. That's a deep personal question that adults struggle with, right? So, right. So as students are going through, be it freshman, sophomore year, get them used to talking about themselves and who they are as people, and giving examples. Like that kind of practice you will do them a world service. So that senior year, like they're only spending their time on the logistics, not on the soul searching part of it, which everyone has to go through. That's number one. Number two, it's just encouraging students to see the connection between their debate life and their school life. Like if you're reading well and you're cutting a lot of cards, there's no reason you shouldn't use those skills in a history class or an English class. And what often we do sometimes our students a disservice because we think that debate is its own world that doesn't speak to the academic world. But wait a minute, we're carding and getting evidence from people who are academics, who've gone through this process themselves. So the more we can connect those two, and not just give students more confidence, but also it makes them better applicants. Because by the time they're in their senior year, they'll be able to already have the vocabulary because they'll recognize, oh, wait, I already know the words that a scholar uses because I've been reading scholarship for 3 years on Russia or healthcare policy. So those are two big things that I see with my clients all of the time. It's particularly debate ones, reminding them, hey, you have a lot of juice here. Just recognize it, like because you're using this every day.
All right. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time out to have a conversation with me about the college process. If, teachers want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah. So a few ways. I'm on LinkedIn as Anthony Berryhill. Another way is on Facebook. Happy to just send. I know that sometimes that's the best way to reach some people. And I can also give my personal email. Along with my essay, it's aberryhill1982@gmail.com. Any three of those ways, I'm more than happy to help people on any formal or informal basis because this is the fun part of my time.
Well, again, thank you so much. On behalf of the Association of Black Argumentation Professionals, we thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about the college process. I know many individuals like myself will take this information as we guide our children through the college process. I'm fortunate that we have people like yourself that are out there to help people like myself become useful to our students that are thinking about college, or at least the future outside of school. So
yeah, I would say, definitely take my offer. If there was one more third tip is ask for and take help. I'm offering myself because sometimes our students don't do that because they feel insecure or what have you. But, frankly, there are people who are paying $10,000 a year for their kids to get into school. That's a hint. We all need help. And this is a place where it's worth getting help and using your resources.
Again, thank you so much. And with that, we're going to end it here. And have a good evening.
You too. Bye.